A shimmer of holographic dust. That's the first detail that clawed its way into Lachlan Kane's consciousness as he surfaced from sleep. Microscopic, iridescent particles sprinkled across the pristine white linen of the empty pillow beside him. Like phantom confetti from a celebration he hadn't been privy to. His hand drifted over, expecting the familiar warmth of Lyra Vance. But the sheets were cool, vacant. She hadn't returned home. A tremor of unease, not yet panic, tightened in his chest. He pushed himself up, his gaze fixed on the pillow as if it held all the answers. The strange dust clung to his fingertips when he touched it, a mocking memento. He could almost hear her laughter from the previous night, light and careless. It's just a gala, Lachlan, not a global summit. But he'd voiced his discomfort, clearly. I don't have a good feeling about this, Lyra. I'd much prefer you stay. She went anyway. He didn't reach for his phone. No texts, no calls. A stubborn part of him, weary from countless unspoken negotiations, hoped this silence would finally communicate the depth of his exhaustion, the constant feeling of being an afterthought, background noise in his own life, a husband tethered by an increasingly fragile ring. He rose and moved through the quiet apartment toward the kitchen. Lyra's artisanal coffee mug, stained with a dark, unfamiliar berry-red lipstick, sat on the counter, half full from yesterday, not her usual shade. A new acquisition, no doubt, for the gala. He remembered the crumpled receipt, carelessly tossed into the recycling bin, buried beneath the remnants of a frozen meal he'd eaten alone. The rest of the morning dissolved into his practiced routine of detached composure. He meticulously cleaned the kitchen, organized the recycling, and found himself glancing at the front door every few minutes, a silent sentinel. The key remained unturned. The door stayed shut until precisely 10:42 a.m. He heard the soft tap of her heels on the cobblestone path outside, then the hesitant creak of the door. She stepped inside, clutching her phone like a sacred talisman, a cloud of expensive perfume preceding her. It was her face that truly arrested him. He still couldn't banish the image. She looked unmistakably guilty, but not quite guilty enough. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on some indeterminate point beyond her shoulder. He simply walked past, settled onto the living room sofa, and let the quiet expand between them, her voice a whisper. Are you furious? Lachlan simply blinked. Furious? No, he wasn't furious. He was finished. But those words remained trapped behind his lips. Not yet, because the truth was, he already knew. He hadn't intended to touch her phone, let alone delve into its contents. But at 3 a.m., as he paced the darkened hallway, wrestling with the urge to scream into the oppressive silence, Lyra's sleek smart display, forgotten in her tote bag in the kitchen, chimed softly. It wasn't mere curiosity that drew him in. It was a colder, heavier premonition. That gut-wrenching tug that warns you something is profoundly wrong, even as your mind clings to the desperate hope that it won't be the worst-case scenario. Spoiler alert, it was. The display lit up, showcasing a single image, a man's hand, unmistakably proprietary, resting on Lyra's waist. Close, too close, and she wasn't recoiling. She was leaning in, her lips slightly parted, caught mid-laugh or perhaps on the verge of a flirtatious whisper. Behind them, the glittering rooftop skyline, the pulsing lights of the gala. A caption hovered above the photo, a brutal digital slap. Lyra brought the fire last night. He didn't need to scroll. He didn't need to read the rest. He simply closed the smart display and returned to the bedroom, staring at the ceiling for 4 agonizing hours. Ready to learn the shocking truth behind a single image? She'd strolled in that morning, presenting an almost perfect facade of normalcy. But the moment she'd asked, "Are you furious?" he knew her composure was a fragile bluff. She had no inkling of what he'd witnessed. His continued silence, sharp and deliberate, landed with more impact than any shouted accusation ever could. She trailed him into the kitchen, likely braced for a dramatic confrontation, an emotional explosion. Instead, he simply poured his coffee and sat at the table. She hovered near the high-gloss refrigerator, nervously adjusting the strap of her designer clutch. It wasn't what it looked like, she murmured, her voice thin and reedy. Thalia dared me to pose with him, as a joke. Lachlan met her gaze, not seeing through her, but seeing her. He studied her face, noted the subtle flicker in her eyes as they darted away. You posed with your hand inside his jacket? He asked, his voice a low, even hum. She froze. In that precise instant, everything shattered. She didn't weep. She didn't rage. She didn't even attempt another lie. She simply uttered, I just needed to feel desired. Those words, he realized, inflicted a wound deeper than any infidelity. He hadn't stopped desiring her. He'd merely stopped the relentless chase, because every time he pursued, she simply accelerated in the opposite direction. Now she was implying she found solace in a stranger's embrace, because he hadn't chased hard enough. She retreated from the room then, murmuring about needing a shower. The moment the bathroom door clicked shut, Lachlan finally exhaled. Here's what no one tells you about betrayal. It's rarely about the act and always about the words. She didn't know he had already screenshotted the damning photo and forwarded it to himself. This wasn't going to conclude with lukewarm coffee and glitter. This was just getting started. The relentless drumming of the showerhead was strangely aggressive, as if she were desperately attempting to scour something indelible from her skin. Lachlan remained at the kitchen table long after his coffee had grown cold, his gaze tracing the intricate grain of the wooden surface, as if seeking counsel from it. His phone vibrated twice, messages from colleagues, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. How could he? The oppressive weight in his chest made even the simplest movement feel like a monumental effort. Her words replayed in an endless loop. I just needed to feel desired, making him feel like a ghost haunting his own home. 20 minutes later, she emerged from the bathroom, clad in that oversized charcoal sweater she always donned when nursing a hangover or attempting to disappear. She avoided his gaze, heading straight for the living room, where she curled up on the sofa and switched on the television. He feigned indifference, yet his peripheral vision absorbed every detail. The way her fingers ceaselessly stroked her phone, the restless tremor in her leg beneath the blanket. She was waiting for a text, a call, perhaps even a reply from him. And that's when Lachlan solidified his resolve. He wouldn't sit idly by any longer. Later that afternoon, after Lyra had stepped out for groceries, Lachlan slipped into their bedroom. From a forgotten drawer, he retrieved her old slim laptop. It hadn't been powered on in months, but Lachlan knew Lyra Vance too well. She recycled passwords. After 4 attempts, the screen sprang to life. The email application auto-loaded. His hands, he noticed, were trembling as he scrolled through the inbox. Dozens of messages from Thalia Sterling filled the thread. Emojis, inside jokes, more photos from the gala. But the correspondence that stopped him cold wasn't from Thalia. It was from someone named Jackson Bell. One email, sent just hours before she'd returned home, screamed at him. Subject, you look dangerous in emerald. He opened it. The message was brief, brutal. Had to say it. That gown almost made me forget you were spoken for. Be safe, unless you're not planning to be. There was no reply from Lyra. Crucially, there was no line of protest. No, don't text me again. No, that was a mistake. Nothing. Silence, he realized with a sickening lurch, was an answer in itself. He took another screenshot, emailing it to his private account. What I'm about to show is banned in 12 countries, of moral decency. When she returned home later, carrying a paper bag containing the single brand of exotic yogurt he detested, Lachlan remained silent. He merely watched her orchestrate her charade, pretending the tectonic plates beneath their world hadn't already begun to shift. But he was done playing the unwitting husband. Something fundamental had fractured within him. And this time, he wouldn't be patching it up. That night's sleep was an elusive torment. Lachlan lay rigid on the very edge of the mattress, his eyes wide open, his back turned to Lyra, his heart thrumming like a trapped bird. At one point, around 2:14 a.m., she shifted beneath the duvet and a soft, breathy laugh escaped her lips in her sleep. A laugh. It was faint, but undeniably real. He turned slightly, just enough to see her face bathed in the ethereal moonlight, filtering through the blinds. She was smiling. Whatever dream occupied her, it wasn't about him. He hadn't seen her smile like that while awake in months. When morning finally arrived, Lachlan was already at the kitchen table, nursing his second cup of coffee. By the time Lyra emerged in that same charcoal sweater, she stretched languidly, radiating an unsettling normalcy. No remorse, no lingering tension, just a wide yawn and a casual, "Sleep okay?" He offered a curt nod and a practiced, insincere smile. She poured herself a coffee, and he observed her phone vibrating silently against the polished granite counter. She snatched it up with an almost predatory speed, turning her back, typing a swift reply with her thumb. He memorized the furtive gesture, the act of hiding in plain sight. He had already decided what he needed to do. That afternoon, while Lyra was supposedly meeting Thalia for an early brunch, Lachlan called in sick to work. He then drove across town to an old university friend, Wesley Donovan, whom he hadn't seen in nearly a year. Wesley was the kind of tech savant who sported vintage band tees under distressed denim and built custom gaming rigs for fun. Crucially, he was also a wizard at recovering deleted data. Lachlan explained calmly that he suspected Lyra was concealing something and asked if Wesley could unearth any wiped messages or data from her laptop. Wesley didn't pry much, just gave Lachlan that knowing look, half pity, half professional curiosity, and said, "Leave it with me, I'll need a few hours." Lachlan drove back in a heavy silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles blanched. When he arrived home, Lyra was already back, humming a tuneless melody in the kitchen. She cheerfully reported that brunch had been delightful, and that Thalia was already fantasizing about another rooftop gathering soon. His stomach churned. He nodded, feigning indifference, though each word felt like a dull blade tearing through wet paper. At precisely 6:48 p.m., Wesley texted a single, chilling sentence. "You're going to want to see this, Lachlan." A jolt of ice water coursed through his veins. He mumbled to Lyra about needing to run out for an emergency gas fill-up. She didn't even look up from her phone. 20 minutes later, he was staring at a folder labeled "Recovered Lyra Vance" under deleted strings on Wesley's glowing monitor. Inside were screenshots, chat logs, and fragmented images. But one message from Jackson Bell screamed louder than all the others. Time-stamped the night of the gala. "You still taste like wild cinnamon. Call me when he finally falls asleep." Lachlan said nothing for a long, agonizing time. He simply sat there, his eyes locked on the screen, as the brutal reality he had so desperately tried to avoid crashed over him like a frozen wave. She hadn't merely crossed a line. She had incinerated it. He couldn't recall the drive home that evening. His mind was adrift, looping Jackson's message on an endless, torturous repeat. "You still taste like wild cinnamon." The words clung to his skin like a suffocating humidity, impossible to shake off. My hands were trembling as I did this, yet I couldn't stop. When he finally pulled into the driveway, he remained in the car for 5 full minutes. Engine off, headlights cutting through the twilight, illuminating the garage door like a stage he was dreading to walk onto. He didn't want a confrontation, not yet, not without more. He needed absolute clarity, undeniable proof, a final, definitive closure. Inside, she was in the living room, engrossed in some reality show where couples bickered over trivialities like forgotten anniversaries. He forced a smile and announced he might have to fly out to corporate headquarters for a last-minute IT audit. She barely blinked. "Cool, when?" No questions, no concern. Just a passive nod and her eyes already back on the screen. That casual apathy, he realized, pierced deeper than any argument ever could. That night, as Lyra slept soundly, Lachlan stood before the bookcase in their bedroom. It was one of those mass-produced, particle board units that still carried a faint scent of industrial glue. Reaching behind a stack of dusty travel guides, he pulled out a small, black surveillance camera he'd hidden a year ago, back when he'd suspected their cleaning service was pilfering expensive spirits. The lens was scratched, the battery half depleted, but it still functioned. He hadn't touched it in months, but something within him, a quiet, hollow resolve, told him it was time. The next morning he rose early, before Lyra, and discreetly tucked the camera into a back corner of the hallway bookcase. positioned to face the bedroom door. It possessed a motion sensor. It wouldn't capture everything, but it would capture enough. For the next few days, he maintained the elaborate pretense of a work trip. He booked a room at a sterile, extended-stay motel on the outskirts of town and configured remote access to the camera feed from his laptop. It was far from glamorous. It smelled faintly of bleach and stale air. But he needed distance, a clear vantage point to finally see. Initially, nothing. She went to work, returned home, scrolled her phone, cooked a solitary meal, ordered takeout twice, slept in, woke late. For 2 days, a flicker of doubt ignited. Had he overreacted? Was Jackson's message a cruel joke? Or perhaps an old forgotten thread? But on the third night, just after 9:30 p.m., the motion feed on his screen blazed to life. Lyra opened the front door slowly, peered out, then waved someone in. It wasn't Thalia. It wasn't a friend. It was him, Jackson. He strode in with that infuriatingly smug smirk, as if he owned the place. Lyra giggled, a light, careless sound, and pulled him by the hand toward the kitchen. Stop! Read this before moving on, because what happened next will redefine betrayal. Lachlan's hands trembled as he clicked through the motion clips, one by agonizing one. Her body language was an unmistakable declaration. The casual brush of her hand on his arm, the way he leaned into her neck, the way they disappeared from the frame. He closed the laptop with a snap and stared at the motel ceiling for what felt like an eternity. She hadn't merely lied. She had transformed their home into a stranger's clandestine playground. The following morning, he checked out of the motel. The drive back home felt like entering a crime scene. Nothing outwardly had changed. The mailbox still leaned at the same familiar angle. The shriveled tulips in the pot she'd sworn to replant still wilted by the steps. Yet everything felt irrevocably altered. The doorknob felt colder under his touch. The floorboards creaked with a new, haunting resonance. He was walking through the ashes of something that hadn't yet been consumed by fire, but already reeked of smoke. She was in the kitchen, headphones on, brewing coffee, as if she hadn't spent the past 2 nights allowing someone else to leave invisible fingerprints all over their shared life. He paused in the doorway a second too long, watching her from behind. His stomach clenched at her utterly normal appearance. Messy ponytail, oversized hoodie, humming a tune he couldn't discern. When she finally noticed him, she pulled one earbud out. "You're back early," he nodded. "Flight was overbooked." That was the chosen narrative. She didn't press for details. Then the doorbell chimed. Lyra flinched slightly, her gaze darting towards the hallway with an unnatural swiftness for someone expecting a routine delivery. "I'll get it," Lachlan stated, already moving. He opened the door to a young man in his 20s holding a lavish bouquet, a vibrant, wild mix of deep crimson and sunburst orange, utterly unlike anything Lachlan had ever chosen for her. "Delivery for Lyra Vance," the man announced. Lachlan stared for a moment, then took the small card tucked into the ribbon. He didn't open it. He simply held it out to her as she appeared behind him. "Looks like someone truly missed you," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. Her eyes flickered from the card to his face, then back again. "It's probably from Thalia," she said too quickly. "She's always so dramatic." "Want to open it?" he prompted. "No, it's silly." She snatched the bouquet and retreated, as if she hadn't just tossed a lit match into a room saturated with gasoline. But Lachlan wasn't chasing anymore. He followed her into the kitchen and asked, "What exactly did you do Tuesday night?" She paused, the flowers clutched to her chest. "Watched a movie, passed out early." "Why?" "Odd," he mused. "My security app pinged. Movement around 9:30 p.m. Thought perhaps someone had stopped by." She offered no answer, instead feigning fascination with the petals of her flimsy alibi. That night, after she'd finally drifted into sleep, Lachlan retrieved the card she'd shoved deep into the kitchen trash beneath a used paper towel. No name, just 6 words, scrawled in thick black ink. "Still tasting you, tomorrow." His ears rang, his breath hitched, yet his hands remained perfectly steady. Because tomorrow was Thursday, and this time he wouldn't be watching through a screen. Thursday dawned, masquerading as any other day. Yet it hummed with an almost palpable tension, an electrical charge in the air, as if the very sky held its breath. Lyra was unusually chipper that morning. She hummed while packing her gym bag, remarked that he looked fatigued, then pressed a light kiss to his cheek, as if she hadn't been systematically erasing him, piece by painful piece. Thinking of making glazed salmon for dinner, she chirped. Sound good? He nodded. It didn't matter. He wouldn't be eating. Around 3 p.m., Lachlan set his plan in motion, a plan he hadn't even consciously realized he'd been meticulously forming for days. He called in another sick day, then drove to his friend Milo Petrov's place. Milo, an ex-security consultant, owed Lachlan more favors than he'd ever publicly admit. Lachlan asked for a spare camera, something small, discreet, that could be hidden where no one would ever think to look. Milo handed it over without a single question. Are you sure you want to see what you're looking for, Lachlan? He asked, his tone measured. Lachlan didn't answer. The truth was, he wasn't sure, but he could no longer afford to pretend. By 5:30 p.m., the apartment was his alone. Lyra had left an hour earlier, claiming a late yoga session followed by a possible dessert rendezvous with Thalia. Lachlan installed the camera in a corner of the bedroom, nestled deep within the bookshelf, aimed perfectly at the bed. It was tiny, virtually invisible, and it connected directly to his phone. He left the apartment shortly after, parking his car down the street in an empty lot from which he could still see their porch, and he waited. At precisely 7:08 p.m., a dark gray SUV pulled up. Jackson Bell emerged, clad in a sleek black jacket and dark jeans, carrying himself with an almost theatrical nonchalance, as if he weren't about to betray the sanctity of another man's marriage. He rang the doorbell once and didn't even wait for a reply before Lyra pulled it open. She ushered him inside so swiftly that Lachlan's jaw clenched. He didn't storm in. He didn't scream. He simply sat in his car, his phone screen glowing in the encroaching darkness, watching the camera feed load slowly. Seconds of buffering stretched into an eternity. When the image finally materialized, he saw Lyra pull Jackson into the bedroom, laughing, carelessly tossing her designer bag to the floor. She kissed him with an easy familiarity, as if it were a long-established routine, as if Lachlan Caney had never existed. Jackson settled onto the bed, already untying his shoes. Lyra stood at the edge, unzipping her hoodie, revealing the delicate silk slip beneath, the very one she hadn't worn around Lachlan in over a year. The image on his phone was slightly blurry, but the audio streamed through with devastating clarity, her voice a soft, seductive whisper. We have a little time. Lachlan closed the stream. He had seen enough, but this wasn't going to culminate in a messy confrontation. He had something else in mind, something that would unfold not in shouts but in silence. Because tomorrow she wouldn't see him. She would only see what he left behind. How spending money can make you richer by freeing you from what truly costs you. The next morning, the apartment was hushed. Lyra was still asleep, peaceful, utterly unaware, curled on her side of the bed as if she hadn't detonated everything they'd meticulously built. Lachlan stood quietly at the foot of it, his packed suitcase already zipped by the door, his phone clutched in his hand. The camera feed was deleted, all digital evidence meticulously archived. She didn't stir as he looked at her one last time. There was no verbose note, no grand, dramatic monologue. Instead, he left the bedroom and placed 3 distinct items on the gleaming kitchen table. Her platinum wedding ring, the printed screenshots of Jackson's messages, and a small, unopened velvet box he had intended to give her on their last anniversary. It held the delicate bracelet he'd never found the courage to offer when their world had begun to wobble. He didn't desire revenge. He simply wanted her to witness, with stark clarity, precisely what she had destroyed. He left his keys on the counter, closed the apartment door softly behind him, and stepped into the crisp morning air. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the crushing weight in his chest finally lifted. There was no dramatic orchestral score, no torrential downpour, no desperate begging or furious screaming, just a profound, pervasive quiet. And in that quiet, something that had been buried deep inside him for years finally stood tall. Over the next few weeks, Lachlan stayed with a distant cousin, then secured a small, unassuming apartment near the edge of town. Nothing opulent, a single bedroom, questionable carpet, drafty old windows, but it was unequivocally his. He began taking long, aimless walks again. He picked up the acoustic guitar he hadn't touched in years. He even joined a local trivia night where he met strangers who didn't ask about his crumbling marriage, people who laughed at his mediocre jokes and remembered his name. Lyra emailed him once, just once. She wrote that she didn't recognize the silence he'd left behind, that it frightened her more than any screaming ever could have. He never replied. Some goodbyes don't require punctuation. They merely demand peace.